Hi, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started now. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time out of your day to join us. I hope you all are healthy and keeping away from this virus that has impacted us all in one way or another. My name is Mike McDermott, and I'm the Language Services Director for MadTranslations. And I'm going to be joined today by my longtime colleague and friend, Scott Bass. And Scott's going to be taking us through a presentation today explaining the ISO 13485 standard and particularly why it's important to medical companies and their translation suppliers. A couple housekeeping items before we get going. Next slide, please. This presentation is going to be recorded, so at the end of this, everyone will be emailed a copy. Feel free to contact me with any follow-up questions once the presentation is over, but if any come to mind while we're talking, please do answer or ask them in the questions box in the GoToMeeting interface, and we'll answer as many as we can on the webinar. And for those that we can't get to, I'll be reaching out to you. So with that said, I'm going to turn things over to Scott for a quick introduction, and then we will jump right in.
All right, thanks, Mike. Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your schedules to be here. I was thinking that, you know, a good modern day adjustment to the aphorism of a 1,000-mile journey starts with one step, or changing windows on your computer. So you've gone from one Zoom meeting to our webinar. Thanks for doing that. Yeah, a little bit about me. My name's Scott Bass. I'm currently a strategic advisor and consultant here at MadTranslations. I've been in the language industry for over 30 years. I had founded my own translation company, a small technical translation and localization services company back in '94. And grew that out over about 22 years, and sold it in 2015, and ended up exiting from that from the acquiring company in 2018. And so now I'm a consultant, and doing the strategic advising role as well at MadTranslations, which I really enjoy. So that's a bit about me, and let's talk about why we're all here today. ISO 13485 is the topic for today, and what does it mean for you as a manufacturer of medical devices, and why is it important that your vendor actually also carry the certification? So my goal today is to answer these 7 questions that I've listed here. You know, what is the ISO standard? How does it differ from other ISO standards that you might be familiar with? And most importantly for our purpose today is, how does translation factor into the standard? And where does the standard itself and the translation process, where do they intersect, and how do they impact each other? What does the standard address regarding product documentation? So the whole issue of what's called labeling. What does it mean for your company, and in lieu of your translation service provider having the certification? And then lastly, we're going to do just really a kind of a quick fleeting mention on MDR, the Medical Device Regulation in Europe, because that also intersects with the ISO 13485 standard. I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes or so, and we're going to leave ample time for questions. As Mike said, please make sure you just type your questions in the question box. And without further ado, let's jump right in. So ISO 13485, for those who aren't familiar with it, ISO itself is the International Organization of Standards based in Switzerland, responsible for the major standards that industry follows, you know, globally. The standard itself specifically addresses quality management systems for the medical device industry. So for manufacturers of medical devices, it's of the greatest interest. Also, those companies that support medical device manufacturing, and including, of course, language service providers. 13485 as a standard for quality management systems is analogous to the older standard ISO 9001. ISO 13485 arose in 1996. It's gone through multiple iterations. The ISO 9001 standard is considerably older. And in the translation industry, I know that it really started to become more prevalent within the language service industry in the late 1980s and early 1990s. So the ISO 9001 standard predates 1345 within the language industry by at least a decade. The standard itself provides a framework for establishing a quality management system for the device manufacture of medical device. And for those who may not be that intimately involved with quality management systems from the ISO perspective, the standard doesn't actually tell you how you do your job. It gives you a framework for how companies need to ensure that whatever systems they have in place are well managed, documented, and tracked over time for their performance. And so the ISO 13485 standard does this specifically for medical devices. So in general, it applies to any organization involved in design and development, production, storage and distribution, installation and service of medical devices. So the translation piece, as we'll discuss in further detail, comes more at the top of that list, more in the design, development, and production side of things. And I'll explain why that is. Okay, so first, just comparing the two standards, 1345 and 9001. As I mentioned, both are quality systems management standards, but the primary difference is that 9001 is truly generic. It can be used within companies that in advertising, manufacturing, you name it, it can be applied as a general management system for managing quality within an organization. And that's why it was adopted relatively early in the translation industry. Pretty consistently, hundreds of companies a year would be obtaining this registration within the language industry. Because it is a very flexible standard and can be implemented virtually in any organization. 1345, on the other hand, is, if you can think of it as an extension or an overlay of 9001, it really builds on top of the 9001 quality system standard, but it's specifically for medical device manufacturing. So what makes it unique and makes it much more relevant for medical device is the fact that it puts patient and consumer safety at the center of the standard. That's really what drives and motivates the standard as a whole, is making sure that patient safety is always at the center of the registered company's focus. What this generally means is that it's going to also require increased documentation within the organization seeking the standard, and also that it requires greater traceability throughout production. We're going to talk quite a bit more about traceability in the latter half of the presentation. So how does translation really factor in here when we're talking about a quality management system for medical devices? Well, that core piece, patient safety, is really what makes translation so important. Because if you think about it, most medical devices, there's a significant amount of information to be transferred to the users, be it the customer or the patient directly, or a clinician who's using the device. So the information that's being transferred has to be of really high quality, okay? Information, for example, that covers safety guidelines, settings on the equipment, configuration, proper usage of the equipment, and other things like dosages, if those are involved, and also things like exposure, if there are any hazards when using the equipment, such as radiation or electromagnetic exposure. All these things had to be communicated effectively and clearly to the patient or end user. And by extension, of course, this means a lot of liability for medical device makers. We know there are slews of lawsuits against medical device manufacturers if there are errors or injuries or deaths that occur due to their devices. So companies, in order to protect themselves, need to make sure they're communicating really effectively to their audience, be they clinicians or patients. So how does translation then impact that audience? Well, quite directly, if, for example, the translation is incomplete. An incomplete translation is probably one of the most inexcusable types of translation issues there are. Making sure that all the information is complete is actually one of the easiest things to assure when translating. But as you can imagine, if there are omissions due to the translation process, that could lead to gaps in information that could result in harm. Also, by extension, inaccurate translation. If there's wrong terminology or factual errors in the translation, that's also a real problem for the user and therefore also for the manufacturer. If the translation is just ambiguous and misleading, that's also is a problem. Again, anything that's going to obfuscate effective understanding and transmittal of communication about the product is detracting and also increasing the risk of use of that product. So the quality of translation has to be very high. So in short, anything that leads to improper or inconsistent use of a medical device that results in results in harm to the patient or consumer is what we're trying to avoid, and why translation as part of total quality management for medical devices is so important. So a bit about the process of the 13485 standard and the translation process itself. Essentially, what's important, most important in the standard regarding the translation process is this issue of traceability. It's a requirement in the standard that actions taken throughout production are traceable. In other words, who did what when, so that errors or inconsistencies in the final product can be identified and the source of those errors and inconsistencies can be found and corrected. Again, this is an important liability issue for manufacturers and the translation providers themselves. It also raises the profile of change management in the document process. In other words, if you're versioning documents throughout your process, how that is being managed to ensure that changes are being properly tracked, carried forward, and that they're all accounted for when they pass through the translation process. So that's an important piece of the document authoring and by extension translation process as well. So the standard talks about labeling, and you'll notice I have labeling spelled here with 2 L's in the middle. That is the way it's spelled in the standard. I figured I'd just stay consistent with the standard, which uses the UK English spelling. And labeling is just a generic catch-all term that the standard uses to talk about all types of product content, so to speak. So it can mean literal labels, instructions for use, typically called IFUs, any information related to product identification, so labels on machines, for example, technical descriptions around the machine that are used within documentation. Specifically, I mentioned that in the context of translation. Any statements about intended purpose, and also any written information that goes to the proper use of medical device, so the actual instructions. So labeling is a broad term. By exclusion in the standard itself, it doesn't include anything to do with shipping or transporting the products themselves. So when we're talking about impact on translation quality, the best quality assurance you can have as a medical device producer is to ensure that your source materials are of the highest possible quality. Of course, if you're seeking or have ISO 1345 certification, the issue of patient safety is already at the center of your focus. So your content, that will be reflected in your content. I'd also like to mention that single source authoring itself as a process, this is not just a plug for MadCap's tools, but in general, single source authoring is a great benefit for quality management of source and translated content because it helps improve control, also minimizes your effort, and maximize your content reuse. And also, when thinking about quality, you can think of the translation localization process as a stress test for your content. And I'll point out why in a forthcoming slide how that factors in. So the standard also makes it, one of the requirements of the standard, quite frankly, is just controlling outsourcing. So I actually have the section number of the standard 4.1.5 here. That section talks about controlling outsourcing. And this is the primary responsibility. If you're choosing to outsource your translations to an outside vendor, this is where the standard really bears on your company the most in that regard, is that you are still responsible for whatever that vendor produces as part of the standard. So in other words, you have to monitor and control outsourced processes. You have to be able to ensure conformity of the product provided by that vendor meets requirements, either your internal requirements or the requirements of your customers, however your requirements are defined. And the standard does allow for that those controls are proportionate to the level of risk. Now, as you can imagine, as I've already gone into, there's a lot of risk inherent in translation if errors are introduced during the translation process. So that's why we're big proponents of 1345, and not just for you, but also for your vendors, because it's probably the most efficient way to mitigate that risk. So the best level of control you can have is to have an ISO certified vendor. What this does for you is avoids the burden of having to define all of the underlying processes that are used during translation. You're outsourcing that piece of it too, and you don't have to carry out your own independent audits of your vendor. You may choose to, but they're not required. The standard itself sets clear requirements for your vendor. Also gives you quite a few assurances if they've gone through the process. And again, if they have 1345 certification, you know that they have traceability in place. This reduces liability for your organization quite a bit. So in the end, all you have to really do is document within your quality management system that you are relying on 1345 certification among your vendor to guarantee or ensure the quality of their work. And you will simply include their ISO certificate within your documentation. So now we have this chain of responsibility from your company to a vendor, both utilizing 13485. I just mentioned too here another section of the standard, 7.5.1, control of production and service provider. I'll just quote from the standard directly. Production and service provisions shall be planned, carried out, monitored, and controlled to ensure that product conforms to specification. As appropriate, production controls shall include, but are not limited to, and there's quite a list of different aspects of production control. But one of the things listed verbatim is implementation of defined operations for labeling and packaging. So you will, of course, be defining these processes for your own labeling, authoring of your own content, assuming that you're doing that in-house. Again, it could be outsourced, and if you're outsourcing it with a technical writing vendor who isn't certified, then you're going to have to account for their process and document that. But it's spelled out quite clear that labeling is a part of your product and part of your production control. So that's why, again, just reiterating why 13485 for your vendors is such a benefit to you. So in the end, you only need to document your internal processes around authoring content management. You won't have to overtly document anything about your vendors' translation processes. So now to that point of traceability and its importance within the translation process. You know, quite simply, it's active tracking activities that affect production of a product. And again, it's at the core of 1345 in terms of quality assurance. One thing I like to point out too is that within that section, 7.5.10, customer property, it's required that customer materials be safeguarded. So that's interesting because, you know, translation, I like to call translation the sausage factory of content, because your original materials are going to pass through a translation vendor, and depending on how you publish and what tools you use, it could be as simple as just converting Word documents, or it could be more complex as a whole health system needing to be reconstructed. Well, throughout that process, your vendor has to be able to safeguard your materials. That's a key component. They have to be equipped and have the knowledge to make sure that the materials that you give them will be safeguarded through their process, and that the end product will not result in errors and flaws due to their process. So that's an important facet to keep in mind. Another piece I'd like to mention too is that the customer property that is found to be unsuitable, and in this case we'll say found unsuitable by a vendor, must be reported to you. So that's where I mentioned before translation localization as a stress test. This is a great quality assurance step for your documentation. You know, any kinds of queries that come back from translators, and translators who ask questions are of high value for this very reason. If something's not clear, the translator should be asking about that. They shouldn't be just surmising what you mean and moving past it. On minor things they might, but regardless, they should be asking questions. And those questions are opportunities for you as an author to improve your content and to remove those ambiguities. So that's what I mean by translation as a stress test. And it goes far beyond that, far beyond the content. It could also go to functionality of more complex technical documents, if it's if it's a more interactive help system, if search functions don't work correctly or navigation is poor, whatever it may be, or the interface is cumbersome. This is where you can use your vendor as another set of eyes on your content. So let's talk a bit about traceability within the translation process itself. So one thing I really want to stress here is that a well-equipped translation provider should have a management system as part of their whole production system that helps them manage who's working on what projects, what's involved, in other words, what files, what materials are involved in that project, and also what steps are required in that project and were actually fulfilled during production to get to the final product. So here I have an example of a workflow from an actual project management system used in the translation industry, okay, where you have a series of steps that are used to carry out translation. In this particular workflow, we have the project or the workflow starting with a project manager who's then assigning work to a translator. In this particular case, the translation is going directly from translation to a reviewer. This would be a client reviewer according to this workflow. And then the client review materials passing back to an internal to the translation provider, an editor who's going to review the client changes along with or in context of the original translation and finalize the translation. And then that process is going to then end with some sort of proofreading task, which here is considered a final check, or you can also think of a quality check. More important than the actual workflow here, which may not be the workflow that your vendor uses or that you prefer to use in your when working with your vendor. More important is the fact that all these steps are being tracked. Here we're using generic monikers, but the actual names of users are tracked. Now, in many cases, in the client review piece, this depends on you. You need to know who's doing your review, obviously. Typically, these will be subject matter experts in-house at within your company. You might choose to use a third party. Regardless, you want to be able to track. You need to be able to track that. And I think the best way is to disclose that name to your service provider, so they can actually make that user part of the workflow and be able to track them precisely within one place. But that's just my recommendation. It's not a requirement by any means by the standard. But the point again here is that all the who, what, why, and when, the who, what, and when are tracked within the vendor's management system, and that's an important facet of traceability within 1485. And interesting too is that a well-equipped vendor is using a translation management system, also known as a CAT tool, computer-aided translation software, or translation memory software, as it's also known. And within that system, there's traceability down to the sentence level, which is pretty impressive, because the translation management system, or the translation memory system, is actually marrying the original sentence with the target sentence within that translation environment, and capturing that as a translation unit and storing it to a database. And when it stores it to a database, it's actually tracking when that translation was created, by whom, and at what time. So you do have traceability down to a pretty deep level. Again, if you're if your vendor is properly equipped. So that's another piece to keep in mind when looking at sourcing your translations, is that are they able to support traceability in that way down to such a deep level? Okay, so one other thing I wanted to touch on here, and actually I'll be asking Mike in a moment to chime in on this, is how does, what does obtaining 1345 certification look like to the vendor? You might be familiar with it on your side, having gone through it internally in your organization, but what does it look like from the vendor side? So I'll have Mike kind of share with us his experience while preparing for certification for 1345 within MadTranslations.
Sure. So there's basically two stages, two required audit stages. The first being what they call a readiness review, where at that point the auditor's looking to make sure that the objectives of your quality management system is being met, and everything is well defined, and they're well understood by everyone that needs to understand it. The second stage, well, before we get there, we actually went through a voluntary audit that was called a quick scan, which is basically an informal stage 1 audit where the auditor comes in, does interviews, they review our quality management system, and lucky for us, we already had a lot of these systems in place and the traceability in place. There was some things that we had to adjust around documentation, particularly job descriptions, and just providing a little bit more documentation around that. But all the major points that Scott covered around traceability and ensuring that the systems are going to result in a high quality translation were already there. So there wasn't much to do around that. The second stage after stage 1, the final audit, is where the auditor comes back in to make sure and check for any recommendations that were made in stage 1, make sure that they were carried out and that the quality management system is fully compliant to the standard. So they're looking at our internal audits, doing a management review, and basically making sure that everything is ready to be certified. We've gone through the quick scan. We went through stage 1. Stage 2 was scheduled for this month, but unfortunately that was pushed back a couple weeks due to the pandemic. So we expect to have this fully complete over the next couple of weeks. Ideally, it was going to be done by the time of this webinar, but things happen. So we should be receiving our certification here in the next couple of weeks, and based upon the results of stage 1, we didn't see anything that would interrupt that in stage 2. But that's the process that we went through. It started with the quick scan just to get ready to make sure that we had everything in place, and if there was any major overhauls that we were going to have to do, that we would have enough time to do that before stage 1, and then on to stage 2. So that's the process that we went through, or that we're going through. But again, mainly the auditor is looking to make sure that the quality management system supports 13485, and any adjustments that were recommended need to be proved that they were implemented before the certificate is issued.
All right, thanks, Mike. And that's an understatement. Things happen. I'd say in this day and age, that's a huge understatement.
Yes.
Yeah, and I can just mention that in the fact that MadTranslations already had ISO 9001 certification actually makes 1345 a pretty reasonable, we'll say upgrade to their certifications, because you already have a quality management system. It's just that you have to put a finer point on it to meet the 1345 standard, and that's what MadTranslations has done. So great. Before I move ahead to the closing slide, which is on MDR, medical device regulation, I just wanted to mention a few points about this whole issue of certification and vendor selection and so on. As I mentioned on the outset, ISO 9001 is a relatively old standard for language industry. It was the first standard to really be adopted within the language service industry. And so what that means is that over the years, quite a large number of translation service providers have obtained the standard, which is great. It's a great sign that the industry is matured and there's more capability than ever in the industry, and that quality is taken quite seriously. But what it also means is that it's becoming a bit more of a commodity in terms of you need the standard to get noticed. You need the standard to be taken seriously. So more and more companies have it. While I think overall it's good for the industry, I think as more companies strive and achieve it, the industry does need to be pushed further to further improve. And with 1345, if a company, a translation service company, is looking to support customers that are making medical devices, I do think it's quite important to have 13485. One other benefit to you as a buyer of translation, perhaps, is that the number of service providers who have 13485 certification is quite a bit smaller than those who have 9001 certification. So what that does is reduces the viable vendor pool quite a bit, and helps you in that search, kind of separating the chaff from the wheat, I should say. I know for years, my company, when I was running my own independent company, we had 9001, and that met our needs and the needs of most of our clients. But I know that eventually we would have gone for 1345 as well, because of the more rigorous standard that it would have put in place. It definitely requires more of the service provider in terms of attention to detail and in regard to their quality, in regard to their documentation of their quality management system, and also that piece of traceability, which I think could be beneficial even outside of medical device. But that was my 2 cents regarding certification. I generally would recommend that for any company engaged in medical device, if they are 13485 certified, that they definitely give priority to those service providers who have 1345 certification. Of course, there are other factors in choosing a vendor, but all things being equal, I'd say if you had 2 capable vendors you had it down to, and one had 1345 and one didn't, then I would go for the one with 1345, because it's just going to make your life easier. Okay. So the last thing I wanted to touch upon is the MDR. The medical device regulation for the EU is not in any way part of the ISO standard. It's a separate regulation for the European Union. Essentially what it does is governs access of companies with medical devices to the market, in that they require that the CE mark, which is probably known to most of you, the CE mark must be registered to the company that wants to distribute within the European Union, and it must also meet the requirements of the MDR. Okay, so the MDR came about because it addresses much more rigorously concerns over assessment of product safety and performance. So again, all going back to that safety piece that is inherent to the 1345 standard. It lays out strict requirements for clinical evaluation, post-market clinical follow-up with products, supply chain traceability of product. So again, traceability is a piece of that as well. Greater scrutiny of documentation. So that's where it's relevant for our discussion here today, is on the documentation side. Documentation is seen as part of the product, as well as software, of course. Software is in itself a product, and it's if it's embedded in a product, it's even that much more relevant. One important point about the MDR: if you were behind the 8 ball and getting your CE mark ready for 2020, the deadline was originally May 26th of this year, but again, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the EU has pushed this out to 2021. I've not seen a specific date yet as to a deadline, but I know it's been pushed out to 2021. So I just wanted to mention it because the two pieces, the ISO certification and MDR, are very often mentioned together, and obviously they overlap considerably. And while ISO certification is not required for the MDR, I can't think of an organization that wouldn't have both if they're going to be doing business in the EU. So there we have it, just shy of about 40 minutes. Mike, do we have any questions?
We do have a few here. Let's start with, are there specific provisions in 1345 directly relating to translation? And the answer there is there's nothing directly related to translation. There is an entire chapter related to documentation, which would then carry over to the translation of the documentation, but there is nothing specific to translation. And Scott, anything you want to add to that?
No, nothing more than just what I mentioned in my presentation, is in that, you know, your best quality assurance for translation is your own documentation. The better your documentation is, the fewer problems that you're going to have during the translation process. So that's by extension, since it's generically covered, they just talk about labeling in general in the standard, and how that can impact on patient safety. If you have high quality content to start with, the translation is going to, a good translation is going to carry that forward.
Perfect. We have a couple more here. If a company has an in-house translator, does the translator need to be ISO 13485 certified? Scott, I'm going to defer to you on that, if that's okay. I know what it took for us as a translation service provider and what it means as an outsourced provider, but for companies that have in-house resources, do you have any
it's a
answer
great
to that question?
Yeah. In theory, just generically, there's no reason why an individual could not carry their own certification if they were an independent contractor or something. In essence, what a lot of the language service providers are doing. But if they are an employee in your organization, no, they really can't have. I mean, they could have their own certification. I don't know why you would make someone go through that, because you're still going to have to document those processes yourself, because they are inherent in your organization. So if you choose to insource your translation, that's fine, but you have to now make the management and control of that process part of your quality management system.
Perfect. So another question here. Medical companies often require translation certificates from translation vendors. What does this certificate verify? I think the certificates that the person asking this question is referring to is more just a certificate that the vendor is saying that everything has been done in a correct way that's going to ensure accuracy and high quality.
Right.
It's basically the vendor self-certifying that the translation was carried out in a way that meets the highest standards. It's really, there's nothing really more to it than that as far as the certifications go from the vendors. This is again separate from the ISO certificates, just what a vendor would provide to a customer that asks for a certificate. Scott, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. There's historically always been a bit of confusion around this within the marketplace. on the buy side, buying translation is, I need, a company will say, we require a certified translation. Okay. All that really means is what Mike just described, is that whoever is producing that translation is willing to, in essence, give you an affidavit to the effect that, hey, this is an accurate translation, and I'll even say so in writing and put my signature on it. So they're kind of publicly declaring, I declare this to be an accurate and complete translation of the original. And that's all it is. And that would be a certified translation. This comes out of the legal space primarily, where that's often a requirement. That's often confused with a certified translator or interpreter, for example. And again, in the legal space, there are court certified interpreters and translators in some jurisdictions. Here in the US, very few, but there are. That's something completely different. Again, none of this assures inherent quality in the translation directly. And a third kind of way in which this is misconstrued is that the American Translators Association offers a certification. Essentially, it's a translator submitting himself to a battery of tests. It's a professional certification. That is another way in which this is sometimes misconstrued. In many countries, certification is very common in translation and is done through an official body. Usually, it's a national organization similar to the American Translators Association, and these are attempts to professionalize the industry and increase its value and respectability among buyers. The requirement of having a translator certificate is fine. I'd say if you already have an ISO certified vendor and you have their ISO certificate, that's probably sufficient, I would think.
Kind of a follow-up question to that, Scott. Other than that, what we've covered in the webinar, using certified vendors that are using tools that support traceability, what are some options that a customer may have to employ and demonstrate that the content has been accurately translated by the vendor? So in other words, what can the customer do once the translation is back to further ensure that everything is accurate?
Well, the client review step in the process is usually how that's assured, and depending on where you place a review and how you do it, that influences your focus on what it is you're trying to assure in the process. So if you take, for example, that workflow I showed earlier, in that case, they chose to do a client review directly after the initial translation. And so what that means is that the reviewer's focus is really on the completeness and accuracy of the content. Okay, at that point, they're not looking at presentation usually. They're looking at the translation in kind of a raw state, usually through a tool, a reviewer tool, much like that translation grid with the source sentence on one side and translated sentence on the other. So that is one way to do it. I'm a big fan of something akin to that kind of content review, along with an acceptance, like a customer acceptance test at the end, where a kind of more holistic review is done, where you could put more efficient checks in place, such as, just ensuring, and you could even automate a lot of it in terms of assuring that, oh, well, the file set we sent through had 1,200 files. We have 1,200 translated files. I can verify they've all been translated. The final product functions as expected. So there should be some sort of user acceptance at the tail end, along with a content review. Those are two things I would recommend.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question here, and it's going to be, and for those that we didn't get to, I'll be following up, as I said, but medical companies often require translation certificates from translation vendors. What does this certificate verify? As far as providing the 13485 certificate, it verifies that the vendor has been audited by a third party and have gone through these staged audits to ensure that their quality management system and their systems in general are up to par and are set up in a way to produce a high quality translation. So it removes the need from the buyer to audit the vendor systems and management and manuals because that's already been done by a third party. So that's all I have for that one. Scott, any follow-up?
No, well, I think the practical reality is that any company that is willing to invest the time and expense and effort to obtain certification is really trying to beat the norm in terms of performance, right? They're going above and beyond. The truth is that for the most part, translation is still a human process. Errors can still happen. The question is, are the processes that drive the whole overall venture, the overall effort, are they in general going to lead to a reliable outcome? I'd say the most important thing is a reliable outcome. A lot of people confuse preference in translation with translation quality. Those are two different things. We live in a time where a machine translation engine can produce a pretty reliable translation and relatively complete translation. The point being that there are lots of different ways to get translation done. I'd say for medical device makers, they want to go with that vendor who can perform consistently to a high level. 99 out of 100 times they're going to hit that mark, 99.9 hopefully. And the irony of these types of certifications, all types of quality management certifications, be it 9001 or 13485, is that just because someone's certified doesn't mean their process is the best. You still have to evaluate what they're able to produce. So, but that being said, going back to what I mentioned before, if I had to choose between two vendors who on the surface they had similar capability, one with certification, one without, I would always choose the one with certification.
Thank you, Scott. I think there were a few more questions that I don't think we're going to be able to get to on the webinar today, but like I said, I'm going to be going through these and I'll email the people who have asked these questions by the end of tomorrow with some answers. But if you have any other questions for us, or if there's anything we can help you with, feel free to contact us. You can email sales@MadTranslations and it will get to the right people. Would also like to remind everyone about Mad World coming up in September in Austin. This is a great opportunity to connect with not only MadCap staff, our developers, our support team is there, as well as sales and the MadTranslations team, but also other users of our tools, so you can learn how other people have implemented the tools and have set up different translation processes within their companies. But that's going to be taking place on September 20th to 23rd in Austin, Texas. And we have an early bird registration up until the end of June. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Scott. As I said, feel free to send any follow-up questions and we'll be sure to get to them.
Thank you.